Alrighty, great games at your table. I'm Jonathan Albin, Game Master J, and this is NycosRPG. And I just wanted to share some holiday spirit with you and perhaps talk about some things that you may not have thought of. We're going to be talking tonight, of course, about being jolly. Of course, this is the season to be jolly, and the biggest question that comes out of that for me is, what does it mean to be jolly, and can you know whether you are? What does it take to be jolly, and what does it entail to actually live in a place where jolliness or happiness is a constant state? We're going to be looking at all of those things, and we'll even have some information about how to incorporate being jolly or happy in your game sessions and how to increase the number of people that want to play games when you're playing. Let's go ahead and get started, shall we? Alrighty, so we're going to be talking for a moment about what it takes to know if you're jolly. We're going to be looking at 9 of the signs of happiness, and while I understand that there are some certain physical characteristics that people might have that might make it difficult to be happy, these concepts that we're going to be talking about are some ways to regulate the unhappiness factors in our lives, because when we get down to the core of it, the very concept of being a happy person really doesn't have much to do with external circumstances, and we'll go into that as we start. All right. So the first thing is that you'll notice that when you are a happy person, worry and concern are dull roars. Sure, we all have emergencies. We all have things that trigger us or affect us or cause us dismay. But the reality is that if we want to be a happy person, we have to find a way to take those worries and concerns and sort of put them on the back burner. Realize that a happiness state is a matter of presence of mind enough to realize that the worries and concerns that we have to, by necessity, be pushed. And I don't mean push, it sounds horrible. The idea is that they're not a big driver for how we feel. Instead, they are things that we simply have to react to at the time that they are able to be responded to. Generally, worry by its own nature is something that we're borrowing from reality and not actually things that can affect us. Generally, worries are those things that we don't have our hands on and we can't repair. So we're going to be realizing that with the worries and concerns pushed to the back of the mind, or released to the back of the mind is a better way of saying it. It allows us the opportunity to effectuate our happiness or present outward to the world what our happiness is. Second thing is that we have to have deadlines and goals that are manageable. If we allow a checklist of items that need to be handled rise to the top of the page and we're not doing anything about it, we are setting ourselves up to be unhappy because we have something on our minds that will take away from our ability to actively pursue this very I wouldn't say it's fleeting, but it's tenuous. The idea of happiness, or the concept of happiness, really has to do with realizing that we can control our time. When we are under time restraints that are unmanageable, of course, we don't have the capacity to do other than respond. And I think you're going to see some tie-ins between these things. The next thing is that the fears and anxieties that we have need to be under control. Yes, standing in front of somebody and speaking, being on a camera, other ways can cause anxiety. But if we allow our fear to overcome us, or we allow our anxieties to drive us, then we're no longer actually providing ourselves with the freedom to be happy. And it's interesting that when we think about the very nature of happiness, it seems almost impossible sometimes. Like as I'm speaking today, I'm dealing with one of my bouts of Bell's palsy, and it seems to be working on my lower lips, worse than my upper lips. So I am fumbling with my words a bit as my lower lip isn't functioning right. So Maybe that's stress, maybe that's fear and anxiety, but the issue is it doesn't change the fact that I'm a happy person, or that I'm exhibiting happiness. Now, there are people who would say you need to present as happy, and therefore whether you are or whether you aren't isn't really relevant. It actually is, because if you're dissatisfied or unhappy, it's hard to present happiness to others or share in the happiness. And one of the things that drives that down is sometimes our financial situation. When we are worried about money, when we're worried about the things that we are trying to do, then we let that stress or that burden bother us. So we want to make sure that even our financial situation becomes background noise, that we don't draw attention to, we don't focus on it at every given moment, but we simply acknowledge that it needs to be handled, and then we resolve it. Happiness is, in many cases, considered to be a thing to search after, a thing to grasp, a thing to hold on to. And the reality is that happiness is the condition of our minds to deal with these things: worries, concerns, deadlines, fears, etc. These all pile up, and we have to learn how to adjust to them so that we can move forward. I'm reminded, when I was a younger person, I used to be in the moving business, and one of the biggest challenges was packing the vehicle for travel. And when we're looking at our individual lives, we have to learn how to position the pack of our load. We have to take our goals and limitations and bandy them about until we figure out a way to bear them, because ultimately all of those things that, quote, ride on our shoulders are things that we've placed there. We build the load out, we decide what we're willing to bear, what things we're not, and in order to live in a happy space, if we're going to be a jolly person, we have to be able to juggle these things. Now, another one that comes up sometimes is other people's problems, OPP. When somebody else has a challenge or difficulty and they come to us with it, they're expecting our help in fixing it or repairing it. And the reality is that those issues are also necessarily put into perspective. Yes, I would be glad to assist you in handling your burdens, as long as you realize I have my own to bear as well, and keep your issues, your problems, in perspective with my own. And if we do that, then we're able to be happier, because we are not dwelling on those things. Also, notice that the idea here is that happiness is a case of our sense of humor. If we are burdened by difficulties and we are burdened by timelines and such like, it's hard for the corners of your cheeks to go up and to be happy when we have things to be worried about. So we have to learn how to let humor just come through. If something happens, we can take joy in it. We can take humor in it if we haven't locked it out or blocked it out. So we have to be able to be, for example, when somebody calls me on a situation or whatever, I have to be able to smile and say, "Yep, that was a dumb one I did there. Let's move on," because humor has to emerge. We have to express it. It isn't something that just naturally occurs around us. Of course, some of us are funny looking, like myself, but that's not what I'm referring to here. I'm just saying that humor has to emerge without a provocation. If you only make something funny for yourself, or you only grab humor where you want to or where you think you should, then you're not really being a joyful person. Also have to realize that perspectives are all that we should find a way to put our perspectives all into proper scale. If something happens and it's a danger to us, then that's certainly something that has to be handled immediately. But if it's something that's just a additional, piece to stack onto the pile, so to speak, keep it in perspective and realize that it's not something to hold on to or to let overwhelm us. And I think one of the biggest things to tell if you're jolly is that you're able to give others the benefit of the doubt. So much of the time when we are dealing with our own issues and our own problems, other people making statements or whatever, we bring with us our perspective, and we try to place that onto what is being shared with us or said to us. And we have to learn how to recognize that it's just as possible that the person who is saying it didn't mean it the way we took it. It's just a matter of our ability to give perspective to the information being shared with us. Ultimately, this last one, attitude determines your altitude. If you think about it, consider a duck in the water. A duck in the water is perfectly fine, and as long as it keeps its head out of the water, you keep your nose up. The idea here is that if you want to be a jolly person, you have to bring jolliness with you. You have to bring that desire to the fore and keep focused on that. So that will lead to necessarily a whole lot of questions that we need to ask. And these are questions that you as a person need to answer, and these are not something that can be answered for you or that can carry impetus without your input. So let's look at some of these questions. First one is, how is your internal communication? And by that I mean, when you are sitting in those still moments and you're considering something that is happening in your life, are you sharing that information with yourself honestly and evenly, just making observations? Or are you perhaps putting a burden on yourself? Perhaps you're carrying over emotional baggage and putting on yourself negative spin. Not so much saying, this is an amazing, unique situation we're in, and I need to figure out how to resolve it. But instead, you're saying, "Oh, I'm so dumb. I'm so stupid. I'm so this. I'm so that." And when you have poor internal communication, when you bring yourself down, you make it more difficult to be a happy person. Whereas if you said, "Oh, yeah, this is something I haven't considered before," or "Oh, yeah, things aren't going so well. I'm going to have to consider what my options are." When we do it that way, then we are raising our eyes up off of the problem and resolving it on an even keel basis. So it's important to know how your internal communication is going and to analyze it on an ongoing basis, because we all have bad days. We all have days where things don't go our way. There are times, I know it. If you listen to my broadcast, you probably don't realize how difficult life is, but you do know that I'll mention something that's bothering me. It's on my mind, and it's important that I present that information from the way I talk to myself. If I'm being mean to me, if I'm tearing myself down, that's not a good thing. So instead, I have to figure out how to couch it. And let me be clear. I have some associates and some friends who get on my case because they are themselves less jovial. They have less joy in their life, I guess. And they get on me because they feel that I'm being judgy or judgmental when I say, "Oh, just lift yourself out of it." But I'm not necessarily saying that you can avoid your problems or overcome your problems by yourself. What I can say is be kind. Speak to yourself in a way that you show how much you care about yourself. And if you don't care about yourself very much, that's something that perhaps we might want to consider working on. I know that in my darkest moments, I almost always am looking inward, and I need to be looking outward because that's where the light comes into your face, right? It comes in through your eyes. But this leads to something else. When you consider your position on things in general, are you optimistic or pessimistic? And while that seems like a false dichotomy, because of course in every condition there is a middle point, a breakaway where we can actually carry over either direction, the idea is that we can have a positive expectancy or we can have a negative expectancy, and the difference between those makes the difference between night and day. If you want to be a joyful person, if you want to have joy in your life, you need to be fundamentally optimistic. Now, I have a friend of mine who says be pessimistic, because when you do that, you're always positively surprised when things do go your way. But to my way of thinking, an optimistic viewpoint isn't necessarily even saying things will always go right, because that would be, insane. The reality is that we need to be able to look at everything that happens in perspective and decide which of those things that we're looking at is bothering us and what is it that bothers us, and look at that in a different from a different perspective. Perhaps we're just not seeing the whole picture, or perhaps the information isn't being shared with us completely. But there's a third aisle, of course, for between those two, and that's to be, uh, well, some people say pragmatic or um, uh, objective. But the reality is that nothing is objective, if you will, because we are personalities and we interact with the things of our lives. We look to ourselves for guidance. I mean, we look beyond, of course, to others for guidance. But the idea here is that when something happens, if we automatically are always leaning to the pessimistic side, we're putting ourselves in a nose down attitude. And as we were talking about before, your attitude changes your altitude, because if you're looking up, you're going to be theoretically moving up, I guess. Now, the next one is to ask how you handle challenges and critiques. And this one is a big measure, because if you hear an objection, or you hear negative input, how susceptible are you to mirroring that emotion? If someone said, "Hey, you did a good job yesterday, but," and then gives you the negative piece, do you focus on that negative piece? Oh, we're on break. Alrighty. So sorry for that. I talked right into the break. I wasn't even paying attention. The idea here is a challenge and critique. Perhaps you're going to say, "Oh, Jonathan, you were insensitive and talked into the break." Well, the issue becomes, how do I handle that negative input, or even it's not even negative necessarily, maybe just an observation. It's a matter of how I receive that information, and so therefore I have to receive it in a positive light. I have to accept that somebody else's opinion might be different from mine, and they might have something that's useful for me to consider. And when you handle your challenges or critiques in a defensive or a negative way, it really means that you're pushing back and trying to keep the other person's input from affecting you. And it perhaps is speaking to your own level of joy for you to assume the negative attitude, negative positioning. When I speak of the benefit of the doubt, therefore, I'm not just talking about whether or not I believe somebody else was speaking negatively or as an attack. I have to instead also look at the fact that the benefit of the doubt might be, in my own case, to think that I'm perhaps perceiving of it improperly. Next one is, of course, do you consider yourself to be proactive, reactive, or unresponsive? If someone does bring something to you, do you push it to the back burner immediately and negate it as if it never happened? Or do you take it to heart and immediately knee-jerk respond? I think there's a balancing place that needs to occur when we are dealing with this internal conversation. Are we looking at the information and responding to it rationally, or are we just reflexively responding simply because we don't want to face the issue, or perhaps we are going overboard and overreacting? We have to think about all these things, because if we are a joyful person and somebody brings up something adverse or negative, it's a matter of our position, our decision to accept it and catalog it, perhaps analyze it at a later point. But the idea of being, the idea of being responsive to something is far different from being reactive to it. If you bump me on the elbow and my arm swings over and I smack myself or whatever, that's a reflex. But that's perhaps not the best way I could have responded if I had found a way to focus on the issue and therefore handle it instead of just throwing out the baby with the bathwater. That might be a better way to do it. Next one is, what are your default expectations? Do you expect things to go right, or do you expect things to go wrong? This is perspective, after all. We're talking about the way you focus your eyes on the situation at hand. Are you looking it straight in the eye? Are you grabbing it as a whole item and then observing it and looking at it in all its entirety? Or are you expecting worse? If you're expecting, for example, in the case of, again, public speaking, if I expect your response is that you'll watch my videos and like what I'm doing, that's a far different position than if I'm assuming that that there's no one in the audience and you're not listening and what I'm saying is hitting deaf ears. Obviously, I wouldn't keep doing it if I didn't feel optimistically that at some point somebody's going to see part of this video and be interested in it. Next one is, this one's kind of hard. How many times have you actually failed? When we look at our lives and we look at things that have happened, I've been a storyteller and game master for 50 years almost. And so the question becomes, have I ever failed? Have I ever had a games group founder and fail? And do I let that happen? And many times people will simply abandon something rather than face the actual possibility of failure. They'll assume that the failure is going to occur, and therefore they are preventing the emotional condition of that. I've had many jobs and careers I've talked about before. I'm a former air traffic controller and microwave antenna installer, etc., etc., etc. And have I failed? Certainly. As a matter of fact, it's sometimes hard to admit, but I know this may be a shock to some of you, but I have been fired at a job exactly once in my entire life. But I've pushed a job all the way to that logical conclusion only because I was wanting to see whether or not I could overcome it. Could I change its course? And without keeping a positive attitude and a nose-up optimistic position, I couldn't have done that, because the reality is that if you have never failed, if you've always just quit at things, then you don't even know what you're capable of, which is, I suppose, in a way heartening. If you've now turned around your attitude and you are now using it optimistically, you can say, well, if I've never actually failed, then I haven't failed, and that's 100% success rate. But it is important to note that if you've never picked up a baseball bat and never swung at a pitch, your batting average will be perfect. You'll have a perfect batting average because you have no numbers to disprove that. You have no level of activity by which you can compare relatively success or fail. So if your default expectation is to always succeed, but you never give yourself the opportunity to fail, then it's a false promise. It's a false reality. On the other hand, if you hold a negative position and never try, then you are setting yourself up to never make the attempt and never find out what you're capable of. Now, when we think of it in terms of, therefore, the number of failures versus the number of times that we quit, that does say something about our character. And it does, in reference to what we talked about yesterday, it means it's something that we need to work on. We need to build up our resistance, our resilience, if you will, our resolve to be able to face those failures. Because without hitting the failure, we can't know that something isn't going to work, and therefore we can have a false hope for it. So then that leads me to the next question, and that is, when was the last time that you won at anything? I remember several of my friends who have, over time, for example, won a radio contest or won a pie eating contest or whatever. And the amount of joy and self-value that comes from being successful is really critically important. And so now this leads me directly to my main topic, and that is the idea of playing games. When we live a life where we aren't testing ourselves, when we live a life where we're not seeing what we're capable of, we need to find ways to do that. And there's nothing like a tabletop game, a card game, a role-playing game even, to give us that validation and that chance to win. And by building up our victories over time, we get better and better at things because we see where we've succeeded and we learn the places where we have failed. And this is really important because this leads to the next part. Are you the kind of, this is a question you have to ask yourself. Am I a doer or am I a watcher? Because a lot of people go through their lives, they've done the minimums to get to wherever they are, and they're doing the minimums to make what they're making, and they're doing the minimums to have the relationships that they're having, but they're only watching, they're only observing, they're not actually being, they're not actually engaging, because that engagement is dangerous. You can run the risk of failure. And this then therefore puts us in a situation where if we are constantly failing because we're not actually completing, and we're not really failing, but we are constantly quitting, then that does say something about our character and our persona and the people that we are versus the people we want to be. So we have to envision ourselves succeeding. And tabletop games are a way to validate, at least at some level. Because in reality, most games, most tabletop games, there is at least some element of RNG, or random number generating. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But the question therefore becomes, when we do decide to act, are we doing so with a plan? Are we taking notes? Are we strategizing? Are we putting in the effort? Or are we just winging it and then crossing our fingers and hoping to the RNG, the random number generator, to make it work? And this is critical. And every one of us is guilty of it at some time. I've certainly done it, where I've hoped for things without putting any of the work in. And while sometimes there are things that do work out, that's also not a measure of our ability, and it doesn't do anything for our self-image if the only successes we've had were luck of the draw. So therefore, we have to think about it and say, how likely am I to undertake an action? And I'm kind of asking that as kind of a call to act here, in that, how likely are you to actually make the attempt? And how dedicated are you, once you've made that resolution to act, do you actually do so? And so I want to ask if you want to care to take a chance at this moment and find out more. And if so, I'm going to ask you to subscribe to this channel. I know that whether you're subscribing in Twitch or if you're subscribing in YouTube, there's a radical difference. I'm asking you to do either or both. You want to show that you have a dedication to follow through on something. If you watched this much information, if you stayed with me this long, you obviously want to know more. So go ahead and take the chance and subscribe to the channel. Follow us here on Twitch. Subscribe on YouTube. Gather more information. Check out my website and so on. I'm just asking you to consider that as we go on to the next section here. Alrighty, so now that we've talked about the deeper part, the darker part, I suppose, of personal involvement in the process of becoming jolly, we need to ask the question, if we become jolly, how do we get to stay here? Nobody wants to go back to be where they're in a sad sack position. Nobody wants to feel the sorrow and the depression. Now, we all do. It happens periodically, even to amazing people like me. That was a joke. That was a joke. The idea here is that we can establish a happiness quotient, a place in our lives where even when things go bad, we can still hold on to our happy disposition. And we're going to go over those, all right? So the first one is you have to develop a personal discipline to act. It was the last point we talked about in the last slide. The idea here is that we need to determine what we are going to do and then do it. Those of you that have been with my show for the last few months, you've seen me generally on a nightly basis to come on air at 11 p.m. I'm a human being. I don't always make it. But the whole point here is that I'm dedicated to the discipline of doing it. Being on air with you is absolutely important to me because I need you to know how you can be as relatively happy as I am. Now, others looking at my life and watching what goes on, perhaps they would not hold to that theory or would not certainly consider me to be an objective or a template by which to live your life. I've got a lot of challenges and such to my existence as well. But you have to develop a personal discipline of action because it's not in the wishing and it's not even in the planning, but it's in the doing. Which means that therefore you need to set and manage reasonable goals for your life. Saying I'm going to be in the air no matter what at 11 o'clock every night is sometimes a difficult one to encompass because different things happen, work schedules change, the hours that I'm available may shift. Generally, I'm setting a reasonable goal of making the attempt every night. I have the equipment, I have the computer, I've got the internet, there's no reason not to. And so therefore I have set and I'm attempting to manage at least the reasonable goal of being on air every night. Whether or not I have viewers or not, that's not what I'm measuring it by. It's do I have the stick-to-itiveness to be here every night? Now, that also means you need to develop healthy perspectives. If I'm creating videos and I'm expecting viewers to watch them, I have to do the work of making it palatable, enjoyable possibly, and hopefully fun to interact. And I don't say it often enough. If you're on Twitch with me and you want to interact, feel free to make a comment in the comment section because I tend to respond to them on air with me as I'm going. And it's not the comment section, I guess it's the chat. But I'm endeavoring to do a better job every night. But I have a healthy perspective, and that is I am but one man, and I am on one little tiny camera, about 3 cameras, but I'm in one setting, and I don't have a footprint and a huge following to start with. I'm building literally from scratch. And so I know that it will take some time to accomplish. I've heard 3 to 5 years, and although I have been doing videos for 3 to 5 years, I haven't been dedicated to doing the nightly show until the last couple of months. So we'll have to see over time whether or not I'm able to maintain it. But the idea is to have a healthy perspective about it. And that is, I'm going to keep making the videos and I'm going to keep sharing because I do believe I have something that is useful and that can help to keep you in the same place and how to make your life into the happy place that I live in, so to speak. The next one is to accept and use help when and as you need it. I have a very good friend that I speak to on a semi-weekly basis who lives in a foreign country, and he's watched my videos, and he brought out the fact that doing too much material too quickly may be overloading the audience, and to continue to do a nightly show kind of to him feels like overkill. And while I can respect it, and I do use his help, nonetheless, the only thing that I've changed is I have changed the focus of the material so that it's generally once a week you get a perspective change. And so therefore, I am accepting and using that help. But more importantly, you have to use it when you need it. And sometimes we're not even aware of when we need it because we're so busy blindly walking through life in auto mode. We're not attempting anything new. We're not taking any more risks. We're not listening even to the audience. So it's important that you are able to accept and use the help when and as you need it, because it's important to make the changes to improve. Now, again, how is this part of being happy? Well, accepting what you have and what you need is the truth. If I was defensive and pushed off that information, I'd be literally pushing down on the very place that I should be lifting up, and that is I need more input. Another commercial break. Well, we're back. So the next thing we have to consider is how to develop the benefit of the doubt skills. I mentioned it in the last slide, and the idea here is that we don't know everything. I often say that the people who think they know everything are annoying, particularly to those of us who do. But the reality is that giving others the benefit of the doubt means that I'm not going to assume intent or even what I thought I heard. I'm going to verify and communicate, and I'm going to develop the idea of it's all okay. When somebody says something negative about what's going on with me, I've got to be willing to say maybe they're right, maybe there's something to it, or I need to also at the same time say maybe they're full of S. I don't know. The idea is that I have to develop benefit of the doubt skills, because that way when somebody does say something adverse, it does not drag down my emotional condition. Because happiness, because it's a decision made in advance, we have to therefore be able to hold ourselves up even when what we perceive to possibly be a negative enters our lives. And therefore, we need to build up our benefit of the doubt skills. It also means we have to develop our communication skills. Now, it's kind of ironic that a person who is broadcasting on a live stream channel and talking with you directly should be saying this, but we should listen twice as much as we speak, which means, in my case, it means that I'm watching videos all the time. I'm looking for what other people are doing, what other people are saying, how they're saying it, the words they use. And by doing so, I'm able to kind of put a stop to the places where I'm making mistakes and bringing in or drawing in the information that'll make me a better communicator. When we listen well, not only does that mean that we're listening intently, but also means we're listening for content. We're not listening only for context. And therefore, we can develop our communication skills, be better at both the broadcast side of it, like in a broadcast like this, or a one-on-one conversation. The idea is that by being a better listener, we can be more appreciative of the other person's position and perhaps draw from it more than what they originally spoke so that we get to know it better. And the next one, this is really, really important, and that is you should expect the best. People in the world do have their own agendas. They do have their own purposes. And honestly, they want to have you hear them. They want to know that the information they're sharing is being accepted, whether or not you agree. They just want to know that they're being heard. And this is critically important because in the reality of it is that, yes, we expect the best from everyone and not all of them are going to succeed. There are going to be people that are going to disappoint us as well. And so we have to accept the best, but tolerate the rest. When something doesn't go your way or doesn't feel right, you just have to shrug and say, yep, that is, and I hate this phrase myself, but I use it sometimes. That is what it is. That is what they've stated. That is their opinion. And just tolerate it. It's okay because they have a right to it as well. Again, attitude determines altitude. If you're holding on to a position that is tenuous at best, it is far better to accept that your position is assailable and then deal with the ramifications of it. But we can stay happy when we develop the discipline to begin the process, to act to make ourselves happy, to act on things so that they don't become problems and challenges and difficulties. But we also set reasonable goals for ourselves, decide and maintain a healthy perspective on anything that comes up in our lives, accept and use the help when we need it, accept our responsibility for our part, what it is we did. And I think I may have been a little bit light on this subject a moment ago. The idea is that when we accept responsibility for our part in life, we are I'm going to use my definition, and many of my friends, if they've watched this far, have been waiting for this because it's something that came up in a game the other day. My definition of responsibility is when you take credit for the things you've done and the blame for the things that you did that were wrong. So credit for when you do things right and blame for when you do things wrong. That's the definition of responsibility. And when we can accept that, then we can move on from our challenges and our mistakes and improve our lives. When we develop the benefit of the doubt skills, therefore, we are assuming in others the same thing, that they are going to accept their responsibility. And we also develop our communication skills by hearing when that has occurred and responding appropriately, with the idea that we have expectation for the best and we tolerate the rest. Alrighty, so now we're going to move on to the next one. All right, and this is kind of the fun part today. When you are traveling, especially in this holiday season, there are often the times that you're going to be in large groups. And I have been asked before, how is it that I stay so ebullient? How am I able to stay so excited and become such a life of the party when I go to places. And the reality is that I follow these kind of guidelines here. The first one is I engage at every opportunity. When I am in a group of people, there's no reason for me to sit on the sidelines because I have something to share. I have something you need to hear. And so I'm going to be engaging with you. For good or ill, I'm going to be making myself available to you and sharing what I believe is important to the story. You need to be able to smile like you're having fun even when you're not. And this is really critical because a person who doesn't have a smile on their face at a group function tends to be the guy that people will ignore. Nobody wants to go and talk to a sad sack. But if you are smiling like you're having fun, even in the moments when you're not directly engaged with people, then you get the opportunity to talk with them. And so that means when you're talking with people, you're going to want to ask open-ended questions. I'm most interested in what you have to say. I really would love to have a conversation in the chat box or via emails or whatever, because I want to know whether the information I'm sharing has impact. Am I reaching anybody? And what is it you're taking from what I say? And I want to listen to the answer. This is important. When you are in a place where you're asking open-ended questions, listen to their answer. There may be more information that comes out through what they express in body language than any of the words you say. And certainly there are ways you can tell when people don't want to be engaged with, and you need to honor their boundaries. But the reality is that if you've asked a question, you need to stay for the answer. And even if you don't directly agree, feel free to nod and grin and give them the benefit of the doubt that what they're saying is A, what they really feel, and number B, they go A and number 2. That's good, John. A and B, that you are honoring their answer, because communication is a two-way process. It's not just one. You can't be bold and brassy and say things and be considered life of the party. You would actually be considered to be quite boorish if that's what you did. So you want to make sure that you nod and accept what they're saying. You may have a difference of opinion. You may disagree with them strongly. But you ask the question and you wait for the answer and respond with it, because their open-ended answer will either end with a question on their part or provide you with an opportunity to ask another question that might be more clarifying, or perhaps steer the conversation completely away if it's something that you disagree with, because the point here is that communication is the process of sharing. I'm going to certainly share my opinion if you ask me, and sometimes when you don't, but I'm going to at least state my opinion, and then I'm going to wait to hear yours, because it's important for me to be part of this communication. I want to be a part of the party. I want to be heard. The next thing, of course, is to move about and gesture. And I don't have the skill. I've been watching an individual on the internet who is a master of hand gestures and communicating with his. And the reality is, there are a lot of times that I don't talk to people. It sounds scary, but I don't get a chance in a lot of ways to talk to people simply because of my physical condition. And there's more to go into that, but the idea is that it's important for you to know that I am a person who wants to communicate all the time. I've been to parties, and I tend to be the life of the party mainly because I do carry on conversations. But the gestures, the hand movements, the dynamics of removing and put on your glasses, these are all things that feed into, I guess, what is it called? I can't remember. There's a term for it. I'll think of it later. But the idea of now it's bothering me. Anyway, we'll go to later. RLP. But anyway, the idea is that you want to draw attention to yourself. if you're telling a story about a duck and you go quack, 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 somebody across the room is going to go, what the hey is that going on? And they're going to come over to hear the story. And of course, being a narrative storyteller as a game master, of course, that's what I specialize in. And so therefore, when I'm in a group, I definitely will use hands gestures and stuff to draw attention to the conversation, because I'm wanting to encompass more than just the individual that I'm talking with. But I don't want to lose the focus on that conversation, because I want to show respect. If you show respect to other people, whether you agree with them or not, you are going to be getting returned to yourself. Pardon me. ELP. I'll get there eventually. You're going to be able to communicate with them better. They will respect you in return. And ultimately, you want to be kind. Even if you are in a conversation and it's heated and you've made a couple of points and it's not going well, you have the capability, when it's your turn to speak, to redirect and get away from that situation and put yourself in a different vein, in a different conversation light. Now, when we do this, of course, we have to express confidence, because if we're unsure of ourselves, we certainly aren't going to be gesturing or drawing attention to ourselves, because we're not going to feel capable of handling that. And we also have to handle it with humility, because although I know how awesome I am, again, the reality is that I have to recognize that sometimes I'm not as smart as I think I am, and somebody else's opinion might be more valid. So by demonstrating both confidence and the humility, it means even I can laugh at myself. The idea of humility is carrying with it also the idea, not necessarily of humiliation. You don't have to let yourself be walked on, but yeah, you can laugh at mistakes, and it's okay. I guess what it comes down to really is that you need to be awesome. You need to be something they don't expect. You need to be as big as life, because we only get one chance at this. We only have 22,000 days, as the song says. We have to be prepared for when it ends. And so you have to be yourself. You have to be the person that you are. You have to be genuine, as words that get thrown around today are words like authentic and genuine. You have to be yourself, but more importantly, you have to be present in that moment, in that conversation, like I am with you right now. I know that there might be a million people watching this, or it might be just you. I don't know, but the reality is that I'm having a conversation with you about how you can be the life of the party, how you can be a happy person all the time. And the whole point here is that whether you're introverted or extroverted has nothing to do with being the life of the party, because even an introverted person can appreciate the closeness of communication when it's being done properly, because as I make my open-ended statements to you and I respond to your questions from me, we're giving each other benefit of the doubt, and we are becoming more communicative. And so just be you. Be the person that you really are, because when you are who you are amazing. Alrighty. Alrighty, so now we're going to completely change gears, and we're going to talk about how do you play games. And I've got a list of them here. This may not be all of them. I'd love to hear your response on what you feel to be the way you play games. I'm going to go over these because I think this is a pretty extensive and comprehensive list of the ways that a person can play a game. Now notice, I'm not differentiating in this case between card games, board games, miniatures games, role-play games, even social games. How do you prefer to play games? Are you an explorer? And when I say explorer, it's not necessarily an explorer of the environment. Of course, many games nowadays are built in what they call 4X. The idea that you are exploring and exploiting an environment or whatever. That's one thing, but an explorer in a gameplay is actually looking for loopholes in the rules. I have a friend of mine that when he was playing a card game, we were using 2 decks of cards. And the rules stated When you shuffled up the cards and you dealt them, you were to deal each person 6. But it didn't say specifically that you had to deal in numeric order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 around the table. You could actually choose which card went to whom as long as everybody ended up with a hand of 6. And this clever person realized that because there were pairs in the games that were important, that he could increase his chances of getting pairs by dealing all the, say, the red cards to one person and all the blue cards to another, and then giving himself a mix, because he doubled his chances of getting multiple pairs. Now, that's kind of crooked, but nonetheless, there was no rule against it, and so an explorer will dig through the rules of a game, even as he's playing it, to look for those loopholes that will give him some advantage. The second type here, and these are in no particular numeric order, simply the order that came out of my brain. The second one's a lawyer. And a lawyer is going to study the rules and utilize the ambiguities, the places in the rules that are not explicit but are implicit, and therefore modify his chances of success failure by which rules are being enforced, and those that are ambiguous, he can therefore gauge and guide the interpretation of those rules. The third kind of player is one who he doesn't mind playing, but he's really not that interested in the game, and instead he decides he's going to be a punching bag. And by that I mean he's going to let others win every time. He's not playing with any intention of advancing or succeeding. Perhaps you are the kind of player who is a helper. You have learned the rules and you just want to make sure others are having fun. So you're going to facilitate that by helping to understand the rules, perhaps overlooking when something egregious has happened that would interfere with the fun that people are having. The helper can be a really useful way of looking at gameplay, but it also can be somewhat of a challenge when you are trying to be the helper while actually trying to win at the game, because sometimes you're actually going to assist the other person in making decisions that are adverse to your own position. Of course, the next would be perhaps you're a mutant, and that's just my term for someone who races headlong without thinking. You're not considering what the rules are to the game. You're just wanting to see what would happen if you press the big red button. And this is certain people, that's the way they like to play, and it's perhaps damaging to the game overall, but that's a completely different subject, isn't it? This is just how you prefer to play. The next one is the boss, and this is perhaps where I start to have an issue with a player, is that if they are trying to be a boss, they're not worried about whether they're succeeding or failing. They're just wanting to make sure that others are following the rules. They may themselves be making rules errors, or they may not even know the mechanics of the game, but they nonetheless are just being bossy to others and trying to enforce into the other players how the game is played. The next are the overthinkers. And an overthinker is someone who suffers from analysis paralysis. Sometimes games have many, many options, and it's difficult to decide which one. If you're an overthinker, perhaps you should be considering games that are less crunchy to give yourself an opportunity to pick up and understand the rules sooner. Or you need to play with an audience that's very patient, because the overthinker can be a time suck to the game, so to speak, and therefore even affect actively how long the game will last. The next are the breakers and benders, and it's a little bit like the concept of the explorer, but the breaker bender is actually looking for the flaws in the design that can be exploited for their success, intentionally trying to win the game by changing or modifying the thought process about the game by finding those weak chinks in the design. Of course, the next are the role players, and this tends to be me. If I'm playing any game at all, I'm going to role play the mechanics of the game. And what that means is that I'm going to look at the random number generation in the game and explain how that fits the, quote, story of the game. If you failed to make a trade last turn in a game, well, that was basically probably because you didn't offer enough in the trade, or perhaps you just didn't talk to the right banker, etc., etc. The idea is that being a role player doesn't necessarily influence the outcome of the game, but it does tend to make the gameplay more enjoyable, because you're looking at say a crappy die roll and explaining how it maybe was caused by the environment or whatever, and just narratively making it more enjoyable. Of course, the next are the wallflowers, and there are a ton of people that are this. They'll come and sit down to play a game. They love being included in the people being there. They love being part of the team. They love the experience of being together, but they don't want to confront. They don't want to actually make decisions. These are the guys that in a role-play game are in the what are sometimes called the peanut gallery, or the second tier, and they're watching the other players take actions instead of themselves becoming involved in the story. And I tend to be the kind of person that breaks the wallflowers out. Eventually, as a game master, I'm going to draw you as a wallflower into the game, and you'll be therefore interacting with us as we go, because wallflower as a position really is untenable in the long term. It doesn't give you a chance at victory. It just simply means that you're not going to be in any confrontations. And then, of course, there's the players. And the players who come to play just love to mix it up. Maybe they take on a role of a boss for a couple of minutes. Maybe they spend 1 or 2 games as the punching bag. They just want to make sure we're all enjoying a good time, and they enjoy the competition and the friendliness of the game session as it is. Finally, there are the scorekeepers. And what's really kind of amazing to me is that there are scorekeepers in every game, including games that don't have a winner or a loser, such as role-play games. A scorekeeper is a person who tracks the values of numbers and counts the wins and losses. So whether we're talking about the number of arrows that were fired and whether or not they got them all back, that is for them a micro game, and that therefore they're going to track all of the details of that. And while that can be enjoyable for a bit, many games don't have a need for such a scorekeeper, so it just is a way of redefining how you play. Now, this has been my list, and it's by far not fully exhaustive, although it is rather extensive. So what kind of game players are there in your game? Who do you have at the table that isn't listed here? I'd love to hear from you, so let's get a conversation going in the comments. Alrighty, so let's move on. Alrighty, so we have concluded our show for tonight. We're coming up on the end. I first of all want to thank you for playing along, for being such a trooper and watching through the entire video. If you have, I do have an offer for you. If you send me a direct message, I'll send you a free copy of the NycosRPG role-playing game. Give me more information. Give me your contact information in that PM, and I'll get it back to you as quickly as I can. I'm Jonathan Albin. This is NycosRPG. I'm Game Master Jay, and you keep on playing. Talk.